Well, for his insights into the crisis at Japan's nuclear power facilities, I'm joined from London by Malcolm Grimstom from the Energy, Environment and Development Programme at Chatham House. Malcolm Grimstom, many thanks for joining us.
Good evening.
Well, there's now been a second explosion, as we just heard, in Reactor 3. We've also just heard that the water levels in Reactor number 2 are dangerously low. From what you understand of the situation right now, how serious is it?
Well, I think the key is not so much those explosions. Clearly, it would have been better if they hadn't happened, but I don't believe that they've affected the significant safety at the heart of the plant. What they both do show, though, is that hydrogen is being released alongside the other gases to keep the pressure down in the area where the fuel is. That strongly implies, or I think it demonstrates, that there is now quite significant damage to the fuel in those areas, that the metal cans of at least some of the fuel elements have broken. We may by now be expecting some melting of the fuel to occur. And so the sooner that cooling water can be got into the middle of those reactors, the better. Having said that, the most important of the many safety layers in a plant like this is what's called the inner containment, or the pressure vessel. It's a very thick steel container. At present, in all of the 3 reactors, the fuel is still within that, and it is contained safely within that for the moment. In the worst case scenario, if the fuel were to be able to melt its way out of those containers, and actually 3 days in, I'm not convinced that the fuel could even have the energy to do that. But if it could, and that's not clear at the moment, they've flooded the area around it with seawater, which I believe, and I think the Japanese believe, would prevent the material melting its way out of the concrete containment in the base of the reactor. But clearly these are circumstances that involve a certain amount of learning as the process develops, because nobody's been in this situation before, and so any of the information and the analysis is bound to be provisional until we know more.
Well, indeed, how much can the authorities say with certainty? Have they actually been able to get anywhere near these reactors to ascertain whether what you are assuming is in fact correct?
Well, what can be said with certainty on the good side is that the nuclear fission processes closed down as soon as the earthquake took place. That is what they were designed to do. The plants are designed in that sort of way. That means we're in a completely different ballpark from the Chernobyl accident. When Chernobyl occurred, the plant was still operating. And in fact, because of a unique design flaw to that particular design, which was only ever built in the former Soviet Union, the power in the plant ran away with itself, and it was actually putting out something like 500 times its normal operating power at the time of the explosion. That meant the explosion was right at the very heart of the reactor. Fuel was spewed for several hundred metres, and an enormous force blew the radioactive material into the environment. The contrast is striking where we are at the moment. Firstly, we're 3 days in, so the amount of radioactivity in the fuel will now be less than 1/20th of where it was 3 days ago and where it was at the beginning of the Chernobyl accident, and it is still contained within this pressure vessel. So we're certainly not in Chernobyl territory, but nonetheless, the longer they fail to get the water in there, they do have measurements suggesting that now at reactor number 2, like the others, some of the fuel no longer has water covering it. That's a serious situation and will lead, as I say, to fuel melting in due course if they can't remedy it. And radioactive materials are being released. It's not a leak in the sense of the stuff coming out through a hole that nobody understands and isn't controlling. Rather, what we've seen are planned releases of pressure in the middle to keep that most important vessel safe.
But let's just go back to your worst case scenario, because are you saying that your understanding of the situation is that even if you got a meltdown in all 3 reactors, we potentially have already had a partial meltdown, you don't believe that the radioactive material would have sufficient energy at this point to actually escape, to get out into the atmosphere?
Some of it would escape. The more volatile materials like cesium and iodine, which I think have already been measured, for example, on the Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier, Some of that material would be released, although already the levels, particularly of iodine, will be falling because we're 3 days into the accident, and iodine only has an 8-day half-life. There would be releases, but they'd be nothing like the scale of the Chernobyl accident, where a cloud of radioactive material, in fact, travelled across most of northern Europe and was detected very more widespread. So nobody would wish to play this down. You don't want radioactive contamination in the environment, and measures are being taken to protect individuals, particularly from the iodine, by giving people tablets of a material called potassium iodide. That all seems to be in hand, but we're not talking, in the worst case scenario, of anything approaching the scale of Chernobyl.
Well, you are talking, though, about now, obviously, the urgency being to try and cool these reactors down. The authorities are pumping in seawater. What does that tell you, and how will we know if and when that has worked?
There are two separate issues. As I understand it, the first point was to pump seawater into the area around this inner containment vessel. That would mean that if the vessel itself began to get hot or even to melt, the seawater would play a significant part in keeping it cool and keeping its integrity. The second issue is trying to get water inside the pressure vessel to come into contact with the fuel and to cool the fuel down directly. My understanding is that the former has been achieved. What I don't know is the status of managing to get water inside the reactors. My feeling coming out is that Reactor 1, where the issue started, may have turned the corner, but I've got no confidence in saying that. I think clearly for Reactor 2, they haven't as yet managed to get the water in there from what we're hearing about the fuel being uncovered, and I suspect that's also the case in Reactor 3. So there are those two stages. The first stage, I think, probably has been achieved. My feeling is that they're not there yet, though, in getting the water into the reactor to start cooling the fuel directly.
Are you and other nuclear experts comfortable with the amount of information being put out, the type of information being put out, the speed with which it's being disseminated? It does seem that there's a little bit of, or perhaps a fair bit of confusion and lack of clarity.
There certainly is confusion and lack of clarity. Whenever a major accident, an incident of this nature occurs, it doesn't follow a single predictable course. Indeed, if it did, you wouldn't have an accident because you'd prevent it happening. So always in these cases, and of course, tragically, we're seeing this right the way across Japan, this isn't a point specific to nuclear, that you get contradictory information coming. People have to make the best they can. Communications themselves have been enormously disrupted in the whole of the area, and so it's entirely predictable. We saw the same, for example, at 3 Mile Island, the most comparable accident, which happened in the United States in 1979, that for some hours information that was coming out was not clear. There were bits of information that didn't seem to fit in with the rest of it. I don't believe that the Japanese have deliberately tried to hide anything. As I think your report said, in 2003 Tokyo Electric Power did try to cover up some safety issues. They were rightly lambasted publicly for that and made public apologies, as indeed did the watchdog. My belief is that they've recognised, firstly, of course, that people deserve the truth, but also that it's very bad management to try and play things down. If you are honest with people when things are bad, then people will believe you when you're telling them that things aren't quite so bad. One thing I would praise very briefly, one thing I would praise the Japanese for is the process of the evacuation, both because that has helped the peace of mind of the people, but it's also given them much more flexibility to concentrate solely on the safety issues without worrying about the effect that small amounts of radioactive releases deliberately carried out. Having to think about the effect on local people. That's one thing that I think they've done extremely well.
Well, on that, Malcolm Grimstom, because we are almost out of time, but those small releases, that issue of cooling this reactor, that's not a fast process, is it? You say we're 3 days out, but how long will that process go on for? How long could those people be excluded from that area around this reactor?
I really couldn't talk about that. In the outer layers of the evacuation, the third part of the zone, I don't think that will have to last for terribly long. But one of the things that will have to happen when praying to God the issue is brought under control, is a very detailed assessment of the local contamination. And until that is done, I think it's going to be very difficult to answer those sorts of questions. But a lot of the material is relatively short-lived, and a lot of that which isn't will wash through the soil. Cesium will wash through the soil and become diluted to the extent that it won't be detectable among the natural background radiation we know about. These are plants with 1960s technologies. They rode the earthquake extraordinarily well, but as with so many other things, it was the tsunami which took out the emergency backup, which is the real problem here, and that may be an area for lessons to be learnt.
Indeed. Malcolm Grimstom, so many questions, so little time. Many thanks for joining us from London.